While President Cyril Ramaphosa emphasized the untruths that have been used to justify US President Donald Trump's executive order against South Africa, the focus must also be on trade and the transactional nature of his US counterpart. And this is Sean Jacobs, professor of the international relations at the New York University in the US. President Ramaphosa is due in Washington for a highly anticipated meeting at the White House on Wednesday, and just over a week since the arrival of the first group of Afrikaner refugees that had added an additional layer to this week's engagements. And Jacobs believes that President Ramaphosa should also be alive to the pitfalls of meeting Trump in front of a live television audience.
There is an argument to be made that President Ramaphosa shouldn't have made the trip, in the first place. But since he's going, I think he should not try to barter or impress President Trump. At best, he would come out of the meeting holding his dignity. I mean, it's a low bar. If you look at the recent meetings that President Trump has had with foreign leaders, you can see how badly things can go. So they can easily turn into a media circus. And even if President Trump ends up being ridiculed, like in his meeting with the Ukrainian president, you end up it still doesn't help the guest. So the guest becomes like, a meme, gets mocked online, and it gets used by trolls who may already not like South Africa at all. So I think what President Ramaphosa would do is to at best try to avoid that. Pattern that President Ramaphosa can learn from Trump's previous guests is that for President Trump and people around him, I think any international relations, foreign affairs, is transactional.
And for more on this, we now speak to our US correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease, who will be traveling to Washington, D.C. to cover President Ramaphosa's working visit this week. Sherwin, this is a high-stakes visit that the president will lead this week, along with 4 other cabinet ministers, and what the presidency has then also framed a moment to reset the strategic relationship between the two countries. What are the prospects of a broad reset, given just how fraught this relationship is since Trump's return to the White House?
Gosh, Mbali, when high stakes is not an underestimate of exactly just how strategic this relationship has been for South Africa and how important it is for the South African delegation to get that back on track. Let's tell you how the presidency themselves have framed this visit, right? To discuss bilateral, regional and global issues of interest. The president's visit to the U.S. formed to reset the strategic relationship between the two countries. So who has President Ramaphosa included in his delegation to undergird this reset that Pretoria is seeking with Washington, D.C.? 4 cabinet ministers, including Ronald Lamola, the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation. So in terms of a reset, given his purview, you think about the situation in Gaza, you think about South Africa's mediation role in Ukraine and how that aligns currently with the U.S. posture in relation to getting Russia and Ukraine to the negotiating table. But then, of course, there are more complicated scenarios in terms of the international relationship, right? In the main, South Africa's taking Israel to the International Court of Justice. South Africa asserting its party membership of the Rome Statute in terms of encouraging the prosecutor to pursue war crimes charges against Israeli officials. Those are areas of discussion. So a complicated international scenario in terms of Ronald Lamola's role there. Then you get Park Stow, the Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition. Of course, this trade at the end of the day. It has been a big focus of Trump's presidency since coming into office, pointing to the reciprocal tariffs that have been put on and wanting to make deals. So what does South Africa come to the table with in terms of the tenuous nature of AGOA moving forward, right? We don't know how AGOA will pan. It comes up for renewal later this year. So South Africa needs to have something in its back pocket in terms of a deal, maybe new minerals deals, the rare earths deals is what Vincent Magwenya of the presidency has been talking about. And then you have Kumbutso Ntshavheni, who has also played a very leading role. She's the minister in the presidency responsible for state security, but also played a very important role in terms of the mediation role South Africa played in terms of Ukraine. And of course, has talked about how they expect the highest levels of decorum in terms of this meeting. Quoting the minister here, there is no one who invites a guest and mistreats them. I will just put an asterisk there and point to Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president that had it tough going in the Oval Office. And then very interesting inclusion here is John Steenhuisen, the Minister of Agriculture. Of course, there is an over $1 billion agricultural relationship between South Africa and the United States. He is seeking to expand that relationship while he expands new markets in terms of South African trade. But he's also there as the only white cabinet minister in the context of the aspersions that are cast on South Africa in terms of allegations of genocide against white people in South Africa, Afrikaners in the main. The first group of Afrikaners have arrived in the United States. So John Steenhuisen will be pivotal in terms of representing white people in South Africa who obviously disagree with the notion of genocide that has been put forward by the Trump administration. I also asked Sean Jacobs, Professor of International Relations and Affairs at the New School University here in New York, what a win looks like for President Ramaphosa. This is what he said.
What is it that South Africa, what is it that President Ramaphosa can convey, when he meets with President Trump? I think it's mostly around trade. South Africa's strategic role around trade is to play that up. Of course, South Africa, the South African government and those around the South African government don't see themselves as part of a U.S., military industrial complex, or how the U.S. views Africa militarily. So that obviously that's not going to come out of it. So I think the key point is to play up on the question of trade. And South Africa's strategic role in that trade. I saw that his advisor, President Ramaphosa's advisor, talked about the fact that there's American companies in South Africa, that they are doing well, that in their interest to have those companies. And I think, I don't know if President Ramaphosa wants to engage in the small Cold War between President Trump and Elon Musk, because the other part of the story, Elon Musk in South Africa, I don't have to remind people of that, plays an outsized role because of his control of X, of this platform, in spreading disinformation about South Africa. And I'm not sure President Ramaphosa wants to weigh into that, but if he can get something around that, I think that would also be part of the victory.
So Mbali, lots to talk about between those two leaders. They meet, of course, at the White House on Wednesday.
Certainly. And I mean, Sherwin, talking about the AGOA issue, AGOA has undergirded South Africa's trade relationship with the United States. I mean, for the last 20 years now, it appears to be tenuous at the same time, at best, given the reciprocal tariffs also then being imposed by the Trump administration. Is the goal here to have South Africa retain its preferential status, or is this an opportunity to pivot a fresh bilateral agreement?
I think South Africa really needs to be alive to end an unpredictable nature of engaging with the Trump administration, with Donald Trump, President of the United States in particular. And so there needs to be an understanding that AGOA has not been a priority for this administration. You don't hear Donald Trump talking about AGOA. But what we have seen in terms of other bilateral or trilateral free agreements, think about the USA, Mexico, and the United States free trade agreement, that has been undercut by the unilateral implement of tariffs. We've seen, the relationship with sub-Saharan Africans and the United States also undercut by reciprocal tariffs. So it's a new administration in town, and South Africa should be open to the reality that AGOA might not be renewed, which means you lose your preferential status in terms of that agreement. So what next? Come with something that you can put on the table to say we can create a new deal, a new bilateral deal in terms of moving the strategic relationship forward. And I think Parkstown in the main has been working on that. I think as a collective, South Africa needs to come with various options so that they can impress the US president in terms of creating interest in something that perhaps wasn't on the table before. That will be a tricky road to traverse here for the delegation. But really, it's going to come down to President Ramaphosa's engagement of Donald Trump and really trying to foster a relationship so that they can turn the page on what has been a difficult 3 months.
All right, Sherwin, thank you so much for that update. That's SABC News correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease there, just giving us, an update comes to what we can expect when President Cyril Ramaphosa and his delegation lands in Washington, D.C. next week.